you once again for being here. Those who are here this morning, we hope you aspire to inspire the others how to become the best compared to the rest. And this is a session we're talking about governance and integrity in conjunction with the World Conference of Islamic Thought and Civilization, WCIT 2024. This morning, wow, we have super heavyweight speakers. This is truly incredible. Looking at the name gives me the shivers, but I'm glad to be in this particular hall to listen to them speaking. Before I invite the speakers, the honor is given to the moderator, Professor MADYA, Dr. Muhammad AZAM, Muhammad ADIL, to proceed onto the stage, together with a panel of speakers consisting of Tan Sri Muhammad Ariff Mat Yusuf, Tan Sri Abu KASSIM Muhammad, and Her Excellency, for the fourth time on stage, Dr. NALEDI PANDOR. A little bit of background of the moderator, Professor MADYA, Dr. Muhammad AZAM, Director General of the Institute of Understanding Islam Malaysia. He holds a bachelor degree in Sharia law from the University of Malaya, obtains both his Masters of Law and PhD degrees from the School of Oriental and African Studies. Wow, interesting. University of London. He was a lecturer at University of Technology Mara, Shah Alam. He was also a Fulbright Scholar under the Fulbright Visiting Award, Washington, D.C., USA. He sits on various advisory editorial board of journals, has been a regular reviewer for reputable international journals. His writing has been published in reputable journals, locally and internationally. His book, Pelaksanaan Undang-Undang Islam di Malaysia, Khayalan atau Reality, won the National Library Book Award. He is also a regular guest speaker on legal issues concerning Islamic law in Malaysia. The areas of interest are constitutional law, Sharia, civil law, human rights, Islamic criminal law, and Islamic law of transaction, muamalah. Let's welcome Professor Dr. Muhammad AZAM, moderator, to please moderate this session. Over to you.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. A very good morning. Thank you, Mr. MC. Alhamdulillah, we are gathered here this morning for session 5 under this WCIT 2024. We'll be talking on governance and integrity. We are blessed. We have the 3 superweight speakers in front of us this morning to talk on this subject. Ladies and gentlemen, good governance is a function of social perceptions in which human societies perceive their governments as fulfilling their fundamental social needs and addressing their hopes, aspirations, and fears. It is also a function of integrity as it reflects on the ability of governments to fundamentally fulfill basic needs of societies in protecting social interests and guaranteeing social security. Therefore, integrity and good governance seem symbiotically connected. Taken together as inseparable ingredients of society, they both elicit trust of the people toward the government, as public institutions under such conditions would enable the nurturing of the welfare of the people. Ultimately, good governance and integrity help promote sustainable economic development. The UN Economic and Social Commission for Asia and Pacific outlines 8 characteristics of good governance. They include participatory, consensus-oriented, accountable, transparent, responsive, effective and efficient, equitable and inclusive, and follows the rule of law, which we have discussed yesterday. In addition, good governance assures minimization of corruption and the views of minorities get represented. Good governance and integrity are paramount and central to the teachings of Islam and the historical siyasah of managing society. Islam entrusts the responsibility of maintaining social order and harmony and national security on the shoulders of the leaders. Leaders of the people are accountable before God for whatever they do and for however they rule. Perhaps the most interesting part in the Islamic teachings on individual and social responsibility and accountability is that every soul is responsible and accountable before God in his or her own right. And this effectively means every individual is a leader in his or her own capacity and governed in his immediate. With this regard, it reminds me to the saying of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, "Kullukum ra'in wa kullukum mas'ulun an ra'iyyatih." With that, we will begin with the 5th sessions on this subject matter, where I have, as I mentioned, the 3 prominent speakers. We will start first introducing, perhaps, Tan Sri Muhammad Ariff Muhammad YUSOF. He is a distinguished legal professional and academic renowned for his significant contributions to the law, academia, and public service. He holds Bachelor of Laws and Masters of Laws degree from London School of Economics under the University of London, and is a member of the Honourable Society of Lincolns in England. As far as I recall him, he spent quite some time at the Law Faculty of the University of Malaya, and after that he practiced, and he was a judge before that as a judicial commissioner, and promoted to a judge and up to the Court of Appeal until after he retired from that judiciary in 2015. After that, he was a speaker. I'd say about 2 years, becoming the Speaker of Dewan Rakyat. And Tan Sri Ariff is the person behind the parliamentary reforms, despite during a brief conversation this morning, he said it was done before him. But I suppose without his interference and intervention, it would not materialize. The second person, Tan Sri Abu Bakar KASSIM Muhammad, reminds me the strong person of anti-corruption. Dulu kita panggil BPR, Badan Pencegah Rasuah. So the moment we see Tan Sri's face, kan, kita akan teringat BPR lah. Those days. Tan Sri Abu Bakar KASSIM bin Muhammad is a distinguished leader in anti-corruption efforts, renowned for his extensive career and global impact. He holds a bachelor degree of social science from University of Science Malaysia and a Master of Science in Criminal Justice from Michigan State University. He began his career in 1984 as an investigation officer at the Anti-Corruption Agency, ACA, what we call in Bahasa Badan Pencegah Rasuah, and then promoted to Deputy GG and also Director of various ACA branches, and then later became the Deputy Chief Commissioner of the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission, MACC, and subsequently served as its second Chief Commissioner from 2010 to 2016. For me, he is, as I mentioned, a person who led and developing the NACP, which was held in 2019 until 2023. And we have, last but not least, the third speaker, as mentioned by the MC. This is her 4th appearance on the stage. Rather, His Excellency Dr. NALEDI PANDOR, who is quite well-known, prominent, and I consider her as a superwoman. The world needs more women like her on this earth, if I might say. But I think I would like not to introduce much about her because this is her 4th appearance. I think the previous moderators or chairs have introduced about her on the stage, and I think I would not repeat that, but very, very important, just to summarize on her background is, he was appointed as South Africa's Minister of International Relations and Cooperation in 2019 and has served in the different ministerial positions until she retired. But I do hope that she will not retire in her real life. Ladies and gentlemen, we will begin with the first speaker, Tan Sri Muhammad Ariff. Tan Sri Muhammad Ariff, I think we will be given about 20 to 25 minutes for each of the speaker, and followed by Q&A, and later we'll wrap up the sessions. Tan Sri Muhammad Ariff, the mic is yours, please.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam Sayyidina Muhammadin Ashrafil Anbiya wal Mursalim wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Dan salam sejahtera. Good morning to all. First of all, thank you very much to the moderator, Professor MADYA DATO Dr. Muhammad AZAM, for those kind words about me, which I very much appreciate. I would also like to extend my thanks to USAS, in particular to the Vice Chancellor and Conference Chair, Professor Dato Dr. Wan Sabri, for extending this invitation to me. Actually, I was a bit reluctant at first, knowing that there will be a lot of very intelligent people present who will be presenting very intelligent and, really searching papers on the numerous topics. And it is very true. I've been attending many of the sessions, and indeed, I have learned a lot. I was also very interested in the topic of the conference, the general topic, that is Together We Stand, Muslims and Global Humanity. I think it is about time we all have a hard look at the concept of humanity and globalism and where we as Muslims stand here in the intermix of ideas on the global scene. Now, that is why I thought I'll just come to Ipoh. I've not been to Ipoh for some time, and participate in this conference. And I was given this area of governance and integrity. These are two big words, governance and integrity. Quite often, if we are not careful, we get extremely confused with these two concepts. They seem to be simple enough, but once you drill deeper, it can be quite difficult. Now, I will be addressing you all on the topic of governance in terms of public governance. It is a governmental governance, in which integrity has a part to play. But I think most will agree that integrity is not just about anti-corruption. It is a larger concept which forms a component of this general idea of good governance in public affairs. Now, when I was a student many, many years ago, Dato' Moderator, the word governance was hardly heard in discussions in public affairs. It was more a discussion on the elements of good government. And then you see the term governance jump into the picture, but not in the context of public affairs, but more in the context of corporate affairs. So we see the development of corporate governance or good corporate governance. And there was a lot of discussion on what would be the constituent elements of good corporate governance. Finally, today we see codes of corporate governance, good corporate governance everywhere in the world. It's become, a global thing with so many commonalities, in the context of what constitutes good corporate governance. It is much easier, actually, to talk about good corporate governance rather than good governance in the context of government affairs. If you're talking about good corporate governance in the corporate sector, it is very easy to lay out the measurables. What do you want to achieve, how do you want to achieve, how many committees you need to form to achieve good corporate governance. This is because the end of good corporate governance is very simple: maximization of profits and protection of investors' investment. It's all about money with a little bit of corporate social responsibility thrown in, more or less as an adjunct to this general preoccupation with maximization of profits and protection of shareholders' interests. But when we jump into public affairs, it gets a bit complicated. Very simply because governments globally differ in terms of content, in terms of intent, in terms of the underlying values that constitute good governance in public affairs. So with that, let me start with the obvious point that both concepts of governance and integrity in corporate affairs have deep moral, ethical, and indeed religious values embedded in them. What is the good in governance and what constitutes integrity in behavior and outcomes are born out of these moral, ethical, and religious values. I mean, even primitive societies have a modicum of values. But obviously, we're not talking about, or we're not addressing primitive societies, but civilized organizations. And these civilized organizations have to serve a common good. They have to essentially be ethical societies, in fact, to serve a common good. So in this sense, we can take it that as a starting point, that governance in the context of public affairs, in the context of governments, really refers to a system of political organization and administration based on a collection of principles and values. And it's not all about law only. It's not all about constitutional structure. It's bigger than that. It's more about a collection of principles and values. And that's the nub of the issue. What are these? How do we define this? How do we actualize this? And it can be very difficult. So, in this sense, the identification of a set of common ethical and moral values is a difficult task, no easy task. And it is difficult to find a template or fit-all template that can govern all countries. Mention has been made by Professor DATO Moderator just now that we have SDG, and we have numerous, actually, global discussions and guidelines on what can constitute good governance. But there tend to be a mixture of disparate values and intentions. Take SDG, for instance. Of course, SDG, we have SDG goal number 16, to promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development. It includes a provision of access to justice for all and the building of effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. What do all these concepts mean? You see, SDG in itself is not a program for good governance per se. It is a program for development so that no one is left behind. So it's a very big agenda under SDG. Even SDG is not quite complete because more recently we have this idea of planetary health or climate health. So we need to add on to SDG to present something more wide-ranging, something more inclusive. So it is really very much a work in progress. But I think we need to differentiate between what constitutes the area of good governance proper and what constitutes those other things, that agenda for development. But mind you, development, good economic development, good socio-economic development is also part of good governance. So good governance is really, the bigger picture for us to aim at and probably achieve with the best means possible. Now, so let me say that the identification of these common ethicals and moral values is not easy. And as usual, more often than not, you see, we gravitate towards Western values, all right? Which is not necessarily a bad thing. We're talking about common, global humanity. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It becomes a bad thing when you ignore the other values we inherit, in the East and through Islam. Some of the values have already been propounded or mentioned by Dr. Muhammad Azam. I will touch a bit on it because I'm not an expert as such in Islamic laws, but I think we must focus our discussion on this aspect of good governance so that we do not lose sight of where we are or what we are and where we stand, because Western values quite often are not quite complete. Yeah, not quite complete. They can lead to very efficient institutions, but sometimes these institutions do not have that necessary conscience or the soul, to propel us towards a better system of good governance. I think we have really to be careful and not borrow hook, line, and sinker, and adopt Western values as the end-all instead of really reaching further. Now, I think another important preliminary point to note is that this connection between governance and integrity really at bottom has got to do with leadership as well. Ultimately, whether good governance and government with integrity will work or be sustained will depend very much on leadership at various levels. Now, philosophies and ethical values cannot work in a vacuum, obviously. We need the presence of leaders with strong moral fiber and integrity. This is a crucial element. Now, I won't go into the definition of integrity. It's like describing an elephant or whatever. You know what it is if you're faced with it. We know. Just like justice. What is justice? Philosophers over the millennia have argued what is justice. And, but we know what is justice or what is injustice when we face with actual or factual situations that will make us think, is it just, is it unjust? But of course there are parameters. There can also be measurables against which we will define all these amorphous concepts. Now, as another preliminary point, I would like to, throw this idea to the audience that really we are looking at a system, not so much, a collection of disparate rules, but looking at a system. And I would like to quote this passage from a very useful book. I hope many have read this book. I'm sure my other speaker have, of course, a very close relationship with this, Tan Sri Abu KASSIM. The book entitled Integrity. It's called Integrity, a National Integrity System. This is a book looking at the integrity system in Malaysia. And then this is what the book says. The overall purpose of a national integrity system is to provide a system of governance that creates trust among citizens. As Confucius told his disciple, Su Kung, 3 things are needed for government: weapons, food, and trust. Confucius had this tendency to crystallize all the grand concepts of civilization into simple issues. Of course, today we cannot speak of these issues as being 100% relevant. He talks about weapons. I suppose weapons nowadays will mean security and stability of the nation. Food, of course, is paramount as well, then as well as now. Food security and all that, and trust. I would like to touch on trust. Again, this is one of the components of good government. Trust. A government that does not attract the trust of the citizenry is not a government that stands on a footing of good governance. So it is a very difficult problem to try and crystallize the elements that will allow us to say this government is a good government based on good governance. Trust is very essential. So perhaps if I can borrow the analysis from the Malaysian Institute of Integrity, we can say that trust is the foundational value or outcome of the applications and actualizations of other values. In their words, the sum total of institutions, processes, people, and attitudes that collectively work to create trust. At this stage, you see, pardon me, we are still looking at grand concepts. Although I began in academia, over the years, I do not stop short of grand concepts. Grand concepts have to be translated into action, into effective mechanisms, into actual processes, actual institutions, actual good leaders, actual good citizens of the country. How do we achieve that? It's difficult, but not impossible. So this is where I think I will proceed to the next point, to look at some Islamic principles of governance. I'm purposely doing this, not because I'm an expert on this, but I want to correct the imbalance between admiration for Western values and a neglect of Islamic and Eastern values. I've already quoted Confucius. There are many sayings, from the East on good leaders, good governments, and so on and so forth, integrity. But let us look very briefly at the Islamic principles of governance, because most of those, or if not all, present in this room this morning are Muslims. And we need to look at it very seriously so that we don't fall into the trap of imbibing Western values without looking at them critically. I mean, over the last 2 days, I think we've been looking at some of the Western values critically. We looked at international law, critically. We are now in a position to say, this is a hypocritical system. Where is the law in international law? The first topic in international law that I did in university at various levels is that ultimate question: is international law law? So I would spend hours, using the Western concept to say it is law. You can't say it is not law, But is it law today? It is law for the strong, but not law for the weak. So when you look at it this way, you got to be careful when you're looking at all these values. You need to, really dive into it much deeper and look at things with a more realistic perspective. I remember also, just to digress a bit, law of the sea. It was being formed in the leading to the conference on the law, the convention on the law of the sea, when I did it. And we were looking at, again, grand ideas by grocers. They all tend to be Western leaders. The only Islamic thing about the law of the sea I studied was when the lecturer said, this concept of admiral, of the fleet and so on and so forth, which actually comes from an Arabic word, admiral. But that's about all that we studied. But now, I begin to realize that the entire foundation of the law of the seas, at least in the original concept of the law of the seas before the convention, is all about trading. It's all about allowing access to markets. It's all about giving or maximizing profits for the VOC. Grocers was Dutch, you see. How do we organize a system of the law of the sea so that it benefits us, the Western nations? Even the cannon shot rule has got something to do with it. Yeah. Now, the cannon shot rule define the territorial sea. Now, they're all values or principles which have something underneath them. So let's look at the Islamic principles of governance. Again, as mentioned by Dr. AZAM just now, the principles of Islamic governance are derived, obviously, and we all know it, from the teachings of the Quran and the Hadith of the Prophet Muhammad. So in Islam, it's not just about political authority, but it is a more inclusive concept. It speaks of all aspects of society, the social, economic, and legal systems. It talks a lot about justice, equality, principle of shura, consultation, and accountability. This is very important. Justice, accountability, equity, equality. The ruler does not exist just to rule. He or she exists and is expected to ensure justice for all individuals, regardless of the social status, religion, or ethnicity. So leaders in Islamic governance have to uphold justice, whether they like it or not, because they are answerable to God, ultimately, to Allah. And they have to ensure that the rights of all citizens are protected. Now, to summarize all this, I think most of you will know, there are considerable invocations from the Holy Quran and the Hadith. For instance, in Surah Nisa, verse 58, ayah 58, indeed, Allah commands you to render trust to whom they are due, and when you judge between people, to judge with justice. This is repeated in a number of other surahs. Justice, justice, justice. Also, Surah Al-Ma'idah. O ye who have believed, be persistently standing firm for Allah, witnesses in justice, again justice, and do not let hatred of a people prevent you from being just. Being just, that is nearer to righteousness. And then, of course, the principle of shura can be found in other ayah and Surah Al-Shura, Surah Al-Imran, and Surah Al-Nisa. I think yesterday, during the discussion on rule of law, Surah Al-Nisa was also mentioned in the context of ayah 58 and 59, and the interconnection between the two. But verse 59 is useful to quote here in the context of our discussion. Or you who believed, obey Allah and obey the Messenger and those in authority amongst you. And if you disagree over anything, refer it to Allah and the Messenger if you should believe in Allah and the last day. All right. And of course, there are, principles culled from the hadith. I won't go into it in detail now because of shortage of time. I know I'm entering 20 minutes. So I have to speed it up. So I think it to be an area which you all are very familiar with. But I would like to touch on something I think is very important. So beyond the invocations from the Quran, the Quranic invocations, and the Hadith, there are other sources of Islamic literature which we can look at, which can be very good pointers to good governance then and today. Of course, we have the Sahifa Madinah, reputedly to be the first constitution in the world. Not many study it in the Western countries, but the Sahifa Madinah, or the Madinah Constitution, is of a more limited scope. It concerns the relationship between the Mujahirin and Ansar, and between them and the Jews of Medina. But I find one other document very attractive, informative, and still relevant today. And that is the letter sent by Sayyidina Ali to Malik al-Ashtar, the governor of Egypt. The opening passage in this letter has great relevance even to this day. And this is where I think I want to read it so that we know where Islamic values stand then and now. Be it known to you, O Malik, that I'm sending you as governor to a country which in the past has experienced both just and unjust rule. Men will scrutinize your actions with a searching eye, even as you used to scrutinize the actions of those before you, and speak of you even as you did speak to them. The fact is that the public speak well of only those who do good. It is they who furnish the proof of your actions. Hence, the richest treasure that you may covet would be the treasure of good deeds. Keep your desires under control and deny yourself that which you have been prohibited from. For such abstinence alone, you will be able to distinguish between what is good to them and what is not. Develop in your heart the feeling of love for your people, and let it be the source of kindliness and blessing to them. Do not behave with them like a barbarian, and do not appropriate to yourself that which belongs to them. Remember that the citizens of the state are of two categories. They are either your brethren in the religion or brethren in kind. They are subject to infirmities and liable to commit mistakes. Some indeed do commit mistakes, but forgive them, even as you would like God to forgive you. Bear in mind that you are placed over them, even as I am placed over you. And then there is God even above him who has given you the position of governor, in order that you may look after those under you and to be sufficient unto them, and you will be judged by what you do for them. Don't need to go far. Don't need to be very philosophical. Don't need to imbibe Western values, and be confused in between. This is a straightforward, simple, and direct advice on how to be a good leader. Not only that, be a good leader. This is a direction. Be a good leader, and how to be a good leader. It's analyzed in great detail in the letter. In the letter, you find values of justice, accountability, transparency, consultation, equality, equity, trust, integrity, good taxation system, economic management, and all that we regard today in this modern day as being highly relevant elements of good governance. So those who have not read this letter, I assume probably all have read it, but it will be a good revision to have a look at it and try to relate it to the current world. So that's the letter. Of course, sad to say, despite the letter, Malik al-Ashtar never made it to Egypt. He was assassinated on the way. But the letter stands as a good document to illustrate principles of good governance, Islamic principles of good governance. So that's the part that I want to talk about Islamic values. Also because I don't want to be caught in the trap, as many are, to say that Muslim nations are at the bottom rung of good government index. You know, we must never think of Muslim nations that way. And a good starting point to break, you know, this misconception to my mind is to remind ourselves that there are values in our religion that promote good governance, yeah? And they are, in a sense, superior to those so-called universal Western values that many of us, you know, happily imbibe uncritically. Personally,
excuse me, Chancellor, if you can just wrap out your presentations.
I've already exceeded. Give me about 5 minutes. Okay, a bit of slides, or maybe 3 minutes. So there you are. We have to think more creatively, and when we look at system of good governance, we have to think beyond the values. We have to think of values from the angle of Islam, from the angle of Eastern values, and from the angle of what do we need to do now to have good governance, right? And the answer is, we must have strong institutions, strong and effective institutions to build upon all these values. Maybe we can take it in question time, but the point I want to stress at this moment is values are good, but don't stop short at that values or those values. We have to build good institutions. And let me say now, since I mentioned it earlier, you can have measurables. You can have a set of pointers or indices by which to measure whether good government exists in the different sectors of government. And this is where I think, Tan Sri, you know, we have our nationals, we used to have the Center for Governance, Integrity, and Prevention of Corruption, GIACC, which, you know, posits all these measurables. And I used to work with Tan Sri on this. I was in Parliament, and they had those measurements, yeah, of what would be good government in the legislative area. I think this is where actually we should be looking at. We are beyond values now. We have to look at actualization of these values. And with that, I stop, since it's been 32 minutes, so I've taken too much of your time. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed, Tan Sri. There are lots of points to take home from the discussion of the presentation from Tan Sri. But what I can just summarize, the important points that raised by Tan Sri is that when we talk about governance, good governance, what he tried to articulate is we have to go back to our country, back to the East, rather than thinking what the West has introduced. Of course, his much concentrations on the Islamic principles. And for those non-Muslims, we can go back to the Eastern values. And a very important document that Tan Sri has mentioned about the principles under the letter, what he described towards the end of his presentations, the letter of Sayyidina Ali that sent to Malik al-Ashkar, and I think it's worth reading it. For those who have not reading it yet, I strongly recommend it. Please read it. It has been translated into Bahasa and also into English, and I think the important points have been shared by Tan Sri. Of course, principles of trust, justice, and others have been repeatedly mentioned by Tan Sri, and it reminds me the 4 principles of the Prophet: Siddiq, Amanah, Tabligh, Fatana. And Amanah, the trust, is one of the important principles for every leader, including us, to subscribe in. With that, thank you very much, Tan Sri. We move to our second speaker, Tan Sri Abu KASSIM. We will give you about 20 minutes. I was asked by the superior than the moderator that I'm sitting on that now we are only allowed 20 minutes. So I'm so sorry, Tan Sri. With that, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Esteemed guests and everybody here. I will take about 15 minutes, not to worry. My presentation is very straightforward. Try to apply the concept of governance and integrity in 2 aspects, which is on developing an anti-corruption policy or strategy, and also developing an effective anti-corruption agencies. It's more on a practical perspective of applying these 2 concepts in our daily life. And of course, before I go further, I'd like to just share with you on the CPI index that came out and try to analyze what happened to the Malaysia, to the Muslim country, where most of the top 20 of the CPI, said to be the most clean country in the world, are non-Muslim country, and 4 out of 5 countries that have the lowest index or the worst country in the world are Muslim country. We have discussion in United Nations and in quite a number of occasions where I have brought this issue into the discussion, and one of my colleagues, a scholar from Egypt, said, Abu, you know what? You know, in this world, sometimes you have to look very objectively. In this situation, in the level of corruption in all over the world, the top 20 are all the Western countries, and 4 countries out of 5 countries, the lowest are the Muslim countries. Let us be frank. Sometimes there is, when you go to this country, you find Islam, although there is no Muslim. And sometimes when you go to the Islam country, or Muslim country, you don't see so much of Islam in this Muslim country. The elements of integrity. There is the integrity of Khalifa Ummah Abdul Aziz, where when you wanted to see him, he will ask first whether it is official or personal. If it is personal, then he will use the candle that is for personal. If it is official, then he will use an official. That question is very important. If you apply in today's world, the question also will be the same. When the leaders wanted to meet you, he will ask about the candle. But the question is not personal or official. How many candles that you wanted to give to me? This is the amount, and the corrupt leaders will ask this question rather than asking, are you going to discuss with me on personal matter or official matter? He will ask about how many candles that you can give me if I wanted to help you. This is about integrity. Khalifa Umar is very strong, has given a very strong indicator if the Muslim can really share his quality of integrity. I believe the level of corruption in the world, especially in the Muslim country, will be different. But my objective today is to share with you what most important is on how to apply the anti-corruption strategy, where it started in 2005. Most of the country, those who have signed United Nations Convention Against Corruption, and everybody tried to design an effective anti-corruption strategy in their countries. Malaysia have done that since many, many years, I tell you. Since 1990s, I would say, when it started with the CPI index in 1995, was been established, where Malaysia was placed in the The score that Malaysia got is about 5.32, and that was the highest that we have got since that. After that, our CPI index is within 5 to 4, and lowest is 4.3. Whatever it is, what I'm trying to share with you, what are the governance element and integrity element that we should have in developing an effective anti-corruption strategies. I'm so afraid about the syndrome of 515 that happened in many countries. I believe and I hope that it's not happening in this country. 515 syndrome is where leaders in many countries use corruption for their own benefit to get power. They use corruption, they mobilize the public, creating a wave that against the government, blaming the government for corruption levels worsening in their country. After everybody against corruption, even the corrupt also against corruption. And the new government will be formed. And this is the real problem. Where the new government been formed and there is no strategic plan, no strategic process has been made in fighting corruption, the wave of fighting corruption slowly diminishes. The voice of fighting corruption becomes lower. And those who fight corruption become the corrupter. Those who claim to be the hero for corruption are those who are involved in corruption. The government that's fall because of corruption started to use corruption against those governments who claim to be the hero of fighting corruption. After 5 years, or depends, 5 to 15 years. That's why they call it the syndrome of 5 to 15 years. Sometimes it only takes about 5 months. Within these 5 years or 5 months, the new government will collapse because they do not have a strategic, structured, and effective policies and strategies in fighting corruption. They do not walk the talk. They claim to be the hero, but they have one problem. They have a sickness, what we call it, a memory loss sickness. Whenever they got the power, they start forgetting about their responsibility because the people who give him the power to manage the country wealth and resources without corruption. But they forgot that they get the power from the people and they start to enjoy the wealth and the power within their members. This is what they call 515 syndrome. And sometimes we can see a lot of countries having this experience because corruption been used and abused for personal gain. It's the mother of all corruption. So, ladies and gentlemen, the most important element in developing an effective anti-corruption strategy and policy in governance and also integrity, the first thing that I believe that any government, any parties has the power to govern and design an anti-corruption strategy, have to put their ears on the ground. They have to get empathy, they have to get the voice and the concern of the public. If you talk about good governance, this is the basic element. Participation of the public in dealing with the public policy. Have a lot of communication with the people. And from there, when the new government in 2019 was formed, the first thing that I did in developing an anti-corruption policy, NACP at that time, is a lot of interaction, a lot of communication. We hear what people want. And from what they want, we develop about 115 policies. And we prioritize. We use Pareto principle to ensure that the top 25 initiatives, the most effective and have the highest impact to be implemented. And the most important element, to be frank with you, after in this line, actually this subject I'm teaching in Vienna for about 6 hours unit. But I have to compress it for about 20 or 15 minutes. You know, the first thing that the government has to do is to do a little bit of risk assessment on the country, on the national level. They have to look into what are the highest risks. And from our experience in 2019, 2018, I discovered that 3 areas in most of the countries have the highest risk. One, if you wanted to reform, you have to reform politically. Political reform is very, very important. If you wanted to have a strategy, an effective strategy, we look into political reform. A lot of my students, when I did my master's student in Vienna, a lot of the anti-corruption policy, when come and they deal with the politician will say that put aside on the political issue. Because you have to focus on government servant. Because that is less sensitive for them. But I said, no, political reform is number 1. Political donation is the evil of all. If it's not governed, no transparency and accountability in the political donation, it becomes haywire. And it becomes mother of all corruption. Believe me, political donation, that's why the first thing that when I was called back to the government, I told the government, said that, look, we have to make sure that the Political Donation Act to be implemented or to be bring to the parliament and pass in the parliament. If we don't discipline the politicians, well, how are we going to discipline the others? In terms of transparency, this is the politicians have to start showing an example in Quran and everywhere. Leader's example is number 1. Our Prophet Muhammad has shown a very good example how many temptations, how many people try to bribe, how to corrupt him, but it's not happening. Osman Empire, Utugol and Sulaiman, for example. So many attempts wanted to shake his integrity, but due to his strong integrity, he was not shaken. So what is there for politicians to declare their asset when they are in power? That is another area of reform that have to make sure that the example from the top be shown clearly so that the people will understand that their leaders show high integrity. That's why the first reform, if you look at many countries who are successful in developing an effective anti-corruption policies, it starts from the top. It starts from the top on the political perspective person. Appointment of politicians in the GLC, for example. It is under United Nations Convention Against Corruption. They stop this because an active politician will use whatever the politician is a politician. We don't get angry with them. They are politicians. But we have to stop whatever we can. And secondly, the most important is that setting up the most powerful and effective anti-corruption agencies. It's one of the most important strategies. And if you wanted to develop an effective strategy, make sure that the law is sufficient in governing the behavior and the integrity of the society. Unfortunately, in some of the Muslim world, unfortunately, when I'm teaching, I was asked and tasked to teach in some Muslim country when I was teaching in Vienna in 2017 actually. And I was tasked to teach one group of law enforcement in one Muslim country, and I give them a case study about abuse of power, because abuse of power is one of important articles in United Nations Convention Against Corruption. And basically, it's very clear in Rasulullah when he asked somebody to collect zakat, MADYA, and the zakat collector came back and said, Ya Rasulullah, this is the collected zakat that I have, and on my right hand is those gifts that I receive during performing my responsibility of my duty. Rasulullah said to him, saying that if you stay at home, are you going to get this? So it's very clear that somebody cannot abuse while he is in power. You've been assigned, and you must make sure that you really deliver your assignment with professionalism, putting yourself behind then the countries or your responsibility. So it's very, very important for any individual, especially the leaders of the country. If you're talking about governance, integrities and all that, we always start from the top. If you talk about integrity, you have three sectors of integrity: the individual, the organization, and the government. But if the first we lost leaders without integrity, it will make the whole organization, the whole country haywire. If you look at how Islam developed in Malaysia, it started with one person. Para Wasmara converted to Islam. If Para Wasmara do not convert to Islam, we do not know. Maybe some of us are Hindus. But an action from one person has made the landscape of this religion in Malaysia change. Majority of Muslims, in Semenanjung especially, are Islam, due to action by one person. That's why in any process of developing an effective anti-corruption policies, number one is so important. Because from my experience, a lot of leaders, they want, because according to United Nations, every country who have ratified United Nations Convention Against Corruption must come out with an effective anti-corruption policy. So there are three types of leaders. One, leaders who are hostile about it and don't want to get involved in developing effective anti-corruption policies or procedures or strategies. So element of transparency that is so important in fighting corruption and the good governance will not become the crux of the policy. An element of accountability will not be there. And the policies that is studied by my friend, professor from Australia, the mismatch between the policies and the real level of corruption in the country is an area that really have to be taken seriously. Many countries fail to do this because when the country is so at the lower level, the level of corruption is very low. The strategy in fighting corruption first is on detection and punishment, like what has been done in few countries. In 1996, two countries that have lowest CPI index, which is one of it is Muslim country, is Indonesia. At the time, the score is about 1.83. 1.83, but with the consistent action by the leaders, continuing action by the leaders. Today, he has surpassed 0.3, 0.4, although at one time, he nearly achieving 4. But he set up a most effective anti-corruption agency in the world. The commitment, the will, the political will that have shown they really wanted to fight corruption has been translated into creating a mechanism that a powerful corruption in terms of the powerful corruption mechanism that easily able to detect corruption. And nearly 99% of the cases that he brought to court got conviction. And majority of the cases are about big fish. But unfortunately, again, this group become victims. For the past few years, the amendment has been made to make the organization become less effective. Due to that, there are a lot of concern by the people. And it cost 5 lives of the citizens try to defend the law. But unfortunately, due to changes of leadership, things now different. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to share with you on something that I believe that if a country wanted to design an effective anti-corruption policy, other than having a good leaders with high integrities and strong political will, we also, as the society, we have to create together and a conducive environment. Islamic values are very clear against corruption, but unfortunately in certain countries, and including Muslim countries especially, between eating pork and spending money, corrupt money, you can see so much different. If you eat pork, it's distinguished. I mean that people will be really hate you, or you feel very big sins. You have committed very big sin. But if you get the corrupt money, the rationalization as a criminology, I understand the rationalization of human being. Try to rationalize that. It's okay to accept bribe money or corruption money. And they didn't see that. Not much different between eating pig, you eat money from corruption. It's not much different, I believe. But because of rationalization, it's not that. And the definition of corruption differ from one country to one country. In a lot of Muslim countries, abuse of power is not a serious offense, especially in some Muslim countries. When as I said, when I teach in this Muslim country, and I give a case study saying that, okay, there is a case where the government servant give the contract to the brothers and sisters. And how you as an investigator wanted to investigate this case. And everybody keep quiet. After the break, then one of the participants came and said to me, "Sir, unfortunately in this country, abuse of power is not a criminal offense." And I look at him, look, did your country sign the United Nations Convention Against Corruption? Oh yes, but in this country, we have not come up with that yet. Do you remember Sayyidina Omar Abdul Aziz about he tried to avoid abusing power, just as a small thing as using candle. But yet, we don't have that law. He said, why do you not have law? Our boss, number one in the country, giving contract to the brothers and the sisters. That's why we don't have the law.
Excuse me, Tansi, you got 2 minutes more.
Yeah, I'm going to the end now. Ladies and gentlemen, based on my experience as a practitioner in this line for about 40 years, if we wanted to really apply practically the issue of integrity and good governance, these two concepts I introduced to the government in Malaysia in 1990s usually. Indeed, at that particular time, the word of good governance was tabir urus. Now he's changed into what they call it, the new word was used then other than. But again, the content is the same. What most important, the element in the meaning of good governance is more crucial. The transparency, development of anti-corruption strategy by injecting a lot of transparency is very, very crucial. And the issue of why most of those, about 20 countries, Muslim countries, are at the bottom of the index. You discovered also that there is a possibility, need to go further discussion on because of these are the poor countries. So the question here, poor people or poor countries cause corruption, or corruption cause poverty. So this is an area that we have to discuss, and how to bring corporate governance or good governance elements, especially in air distinctions. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much, Tan Sri. I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but I have no jurisdiction whatsoever to allow you to continue because we are having a time constraint for these sessions. But I think very important thing that if Tan Sri is given an opportunity to share with your thoughts and your experience of decades in these anti-corruption policies or exercises, I think the authority or the government should take up that. In Bahasa Melayu, in the beginning of the presentations, terlalu pedas telinga. So many points that you have shared, telinga ni pedas lah. For those who are leaders, who have been practicing corruptions to gain power. And I think you have given us a very good analogy how the Malays, the Muslim Malays, in Malaysia, when we call Malays, they must be Muslims by the interpretation of the constitutions. They can avoid eating pork, but when it comes to corruptions, in Bahasa, we call it rasuah, they say, it simply say it is fine. So perhaps we have to use the word of babi rasuah rather than rasuah. So that the word babi is there, so that you can avoid eating babi rasuah. If that's the case, I suppose. And I think the very important point that raised by Tan Sri is we must have these political reforms in promoting and exercising all these policies of anti-corruption. And of course, we need a person like Tan Sri to educate for the leaders of the country to change the country. Otherwise, we'll be repeating again and again the mistakes and the behavior, or we call it the cultures. Tak apa, this is the system in Malaysia. With that, thank you very much, Tan Sri. I'm so sorry that I have to stop you for that matter. The last speaker for today's morning sessions is Her Excellency Dr. NALEDI PANDOR. So I suppose that you are also given about 20 minutes to share your points on this governance and integrity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to our distinguished moderator for this opportunity. And I wish to thank my fellow panelists as well for setting out the issues so clearly. So, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. The two panelists that have spoken before me are clearly experts on this question. I am not an expert on the issue that has been put before us, so I'm going to approach it from somewhat of a different perspective. But allow me to begin by reminding us of the theme of the conference. It reads, "Together we stand, Muslims and global humanity." When we study the Quran, we read surahs that tell us that, "Oh, my creation, you are among the most fortunate to have this learning of the Quran." Because as Sultan said in his address on the first day of the conference, we are expected to live according to the highest values because we are beneficiaries of the last of the testaments that were provided to humanity as a guide in terms of how we live our lives, in terms of the principles that we should practice. And so the expectation is not that we should see ourselves as different from others, but that we should exude and live and reflect the best values. So when I examine the matter of this morning's session of governance and integrity, I begin from the personal. And I recall for you today questions that are often posed to my own community of Muslims in South Africa. And I often ask, we refer to ourselves as practicing the best values and principles. And so I ask my fellow community, how do you treat your wife? How do you treat your daughters? How do you treat people who are different from yourself? Because I believe integrity begins from the individual to the family, to the community, to the globe. I ask my fellow Muslims, do you have any employees that fall under your authority and that earn a salary from your own income, from your business? Do you respect your employees' rights as workers? In our country, South Africa, as in many countries of the world, we have what are called minimum wages that should be paid to employees, especially in the risky categories. Domestic workers, workers in our businesses, our stores, who often don't enjoy full workers' rights. So I ask my fellow Muslims, how do you treat these people? Do you pay them the basic wage stated in law, or are you paying them slave wages? If you are not paying them the basic wage, you do not have integrity. So integrity begins from the personal. And I think this is a very important aspect that we need to lift out. I then come back. If we go from personal to family to community, as a member of family, when your parents send you to the store to purchase a loaf of bread because they forgot to buy it, and they give you a certain sum of money to purchase those goods, and there is change from the errand you have undertaken, what do you do with that change? Do you return it to your parents, or are you that child who pockets your parents' change? If you pocket it and you grow up doing this repeatedly, you will be an adult without integrity. So the family and how we raise our children and the practices that we teach them lead to a community of integrity. But if in the family those learnings do not happen, you are building a community without integrity. But then let me come to the full theme of governance and integrity. I recall reading, and I hope many of you have had the opportunity to read it, the book of Nelson Mandela on his life, called Long Walk to Freedom. if you have read that book, in the early chapters, he talks about his life living in what he calls a traditional community in a rural village. And he describes the conduct of the traditional leader and says that this that he observed influenced how he conducted himself as a political leader. He describes the setting. He says, when we have a matter that must be resolved by our community, our traditional chief summons us to a meeting. He sits in the center of the community, not at its head. And the rest of the community sits around him. Our leader would introduce the subject and then patiently will ask each member of the community who wishes to make a contribution what they would like to say. And he gives them the opportunity to speak. After everyone has spoken, the leader takes account of all the views, integrates the key points, and presents to them a summation of what they wished to conclude on the subject. He said the sign of good leadership is inclusion, it's giving opportunity for all to be heard, and it is being receptive to many different ideas. So leadership, inclusion, listening ability, democratic, readiness to learn from others, all of these are attributes that are closely associated with governance and with integrity. But for a state to have good governance, as my colleagues have indicated, I wish to posit the view that firstly, you need a constitutional framework to be in place. I have found that countries that do not have a constitution tend to rely on arbitrary lawmaking, and it is difficult for the populace to actually assess what is this government all about. Because a constitutional framework states the values, the principles, the institutions, the practice, and serves as a guide for lawmakers, and so helps to avoid arbitrariness. If you do not have a constitutional framework, if the president is annoyed on one day, he will just pass some harsh law. If he's happy the next day, he will develop some other form of law. But when you have a constitution, you have provided a framework that then allows for a society that is ordered, that acts in the basis of stated values and principles. So I think to have good governance and integrity, you need a formal constitutional framework. Constitutional framework also allows you to create public institutions that exist over time and act in the general good and do not act for individuals. In some countries, you have leaders who believe they are the judge, they are the jury, they are everything in society. But if you have a constitution, it spells out the institutions you should have in the public sector and the role that each institution will play. A third feature of good governance is you must have a parliament, again, one governed by that constitutional framework, but one that is elected by the people and that is there to represent the people. A parliament elected by the people must be democratic, it must be open, and should allow access of the public to that parliament to know what the lawmakers are saying, what laws they are framing, and how they exercise their role of watchdog and oversight over the executive. So an open and effective parliament is vital. We also must ensure that we create institutions that win the trust of the public. If you have one of the institutional bodies of the Constitution as a Human Rights Commission, and that commission examines human rights issues, but always rules in favor of the government and not in favor of you and the disputes you have brought forward, that institution is failing and it will never win public trust. If you have a judiciary that doesn't observe the laws, that isn't alert to the context and the application of law, that judiciary will not win public trust. So public trust is important to governance and integrity. You must also not have in a country a parliament that always wants to operate behind closed doors. A parliament that doesn't publish its annual reports. So in order to have good governance and integrity, you must have transparency in society. If you want to know what did the Committee on Finance discuss last Wednesday, you should be able to access the record of Parliament on that discussion. That is transparency. And because the politicians know that you can have the right to listen into everything they say, they will pay much more careful attention to your interests and needs. So transparency, absolutely important. There should also be, as our earlier panelists said, accountability in society. The governance institutions must tell the public honestly what it is they're doing. How was the money spent? What concretely was achieved? What instruments are used for accounting? Does the Prime Minister take questions in the Assembly? Or are they so afraid of the public that they'll never appear in Parliament? When you have leaders who won't come to Parliament to answer questions, you should be worried that they're trying to hide something, and you should worry about the level of integrity. A society that has good governance and integrity has the public interest at its core and ensures public engagement. In South Africa, our Parliament goes out to the public to hold open meetings on a regular basis so that the public engages on a large number of members of Parliament and can speak to them about the concerns of the people. A society that seeks to achieve good governance and integrity cannot close down the media. And so freedom of expression is important. If you are arrested because of what you say, and the political leaders don't have the confidence in their ability to respond to you, you have a problem of integrity. Freedom of expression is critical. Of course, you have to have rules. It can't be absolute. You cannot use free expression to promote hate, to promote racism, to promote violence. But you should have freedom of expression. It's important. You must also have executive accountability. Ministers must account. You must have lifestyle audits of ministers. We should know what money they hold, what interests they have. In South Africa, if you serve in government, you can't have businesses. If you want to be a business person, stay with your business. But if you wish to be in government, you've got to relieve yourself of your business interests while you serve in government. And there is an executive code where the executive is required to report every year on what gifts they receive, on what hospitality they receive, and all elements that are often associated with poor practices of integrity. And those executive code reports are published in the public media for everybody to see. So if someone gave you something and you don't remember the gift in your executive report, they can come to Parliament and say, I know that minister received the following because I gave it to her, and you then have to report to Parliament why you missed that aspect in your accounting to the public and to Parliament. There must also be instruments to curb corruption, as has been said already, if you are to have a society that has integrity within it. There must be an effective prosecutorial authority. The Attorney General or the public prosecutor must be free of influence from government, and they must be able to execute their role without fear, favor, or prejudice. So whether you are the president, a minister, or the Speaker of the House, if you have committed an infringement, the prosecutor must know they must arrest you, and no one will act against them. So an independent prosecutorial authority is closely associated with governance and integrity.
Excuse me, Excellency, you got 2 minutes more.
Thank you. As I said earlier, there must also be individual honesty and integrity, because we can't guard the people in our institutions all the time. So we have to have faith that they're able to govern themselves as well, that they're honest, that they practice integrity. And as I said, this is learned within family, it is learned within community. Individual honesty and integrity. And of course, you will be a person of integrity if you treat all persons in the same way. If you are discriminatory toward a person because they are black, or they're a woman, or they're a Christian, or they are youth, then we cannot regard you as a person of integrity. Because a person of integrity does not make a distinction because of your humanity. We are all human beings, and we must treat each other equally. We must also have respect for diversity. So I do want us, while we have great admiration for ourselves as Muslims, I think we must also have humility and have appreciation for those in other religions as well. We must not look down on anyone as Muslims. In fact, to be among the best is to respect and honor everyone. Finally, governance and integrity means through your actions, you seek to achieve equality for all. So in our constitution in South Africa, we have a chapter called the Bill of Rights, which sets out civil, political, socioeconomic, and third-generation rights. But what the Constitution says is the exercise of all these rights has to be in the context of the first clause in the Bill of Rights, which is the clause on equality. So if your practice of one of the rights, which is religious freedom in our Constitution, is a practice that seeks to undermine another religion, you will be infringing the equality clause. So for governance and integrity, the trumping clause must always be equality. I thank you very much for this opportunity, and I hope we'll have a good discussion. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you very much indeed, Her Excellency Dr. NALEDI PANDOR, for a very many tips of all these subjects on good governance and integrity, taking into account her experience from the country that he belongs to. And of course, one of the important points that I think I could share from the presentations is, if you want to practice or to observe integrity, you have to go back to basic. Means it has to go back to individual, it has to go back to the family. The practice of that is very important. Otherwise, it will not go anywhere. It does not go anywhere in the sense that people believe, for examples, for leaders and etc., that, for examples, with the, examples given by the previous speakers, the culture of corruptions, unfortunately being practiced freely. Her Excellency also mentioned about three important elements for the notion of good governance to be practiced. One is the constitutional framework, which he has articulated quite well. Another one is with regard to setting up public institutions in order to take up that policy. And of course, representatives elected by the people so that they are answerable to the people. And of course, there are values that has been shared by her. Of course, it is a very important of this trust, again, the public trust, transparency, accountability, so on and so on. But I think what important, the last points given by Her Excellency is how we, as human beings, practice these important notions starting from ourselves, starting from our family, and it goes out there. With that, thank you very much, Her Excellency. We have about 10 minutes for Q&A. I would like to give the opportunity for the audience who are in front of us. Is there any hands? Do you have any questions pertaining to the subject matter that we are now engaging on or at?
Bismillah.
Assalamualaikum.
Assalamualaikum.
Okay.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Yeah.
Please mention your name and very precise and short.
My name is Mohamad Hafiz from UITM.
Okay, Hafiz.
I have two questions for our two giants, national giants in public affairs. One for Tan Sri Ariff. I think you have unfinished business in your opening remarks with regards to the good institution and the indices or parameters of this good institution. And then our second giant, Tan Sri Abu KASSIM. Very powerful and impactful speech just now. You have mentioned, I think, 5 parameters, which is on, this is with regards to the risk assessment. So you have political donation, transparency, appointment of politicians in GLCs, and then we have to set.
When we speak of institutions in this context of governance, we're not looking merely at institutions per se. You're looking at effective institutions against a certain framework of good governance, you know? And of course, Her Excellency has stated just now how important constitutions are. And I take the point that the South African Constitution has a preamble which can easily rank as among the best globally. It's very good. We have studied the preamble, very well done. We have the Rukun Negara, but the Rukun Negara is not a preamble to the Constitution. And this is where it does not have the force which is necessary to have that grounding of law to support good governance. It is something that you find at the back of a student's exercise book. That's what it is. And over time, you tend to neglect it. So very important to have a good constitutional framework. I agree 100%. And in Malaysia, to some extent, we have it. Ours is a very complex constitution, very detailed, but we lack a preamble. It's a pity. But there are other constitutions, you know, which look very good on paper. Yeah, I've seen one example. I won't mention the country, among the best constitutions in the world in terms of drafting a good constitution. But you know, in that country, everything failed because suddenly the political culture changed and you had military boots in the House of Parliament. You know, so there you are. So the important thing to support institutions must be, as has been mentioned, good political culture to support this idea of good governance. You know, in terms of parliament, you know, you have seen how our parliament works, and globally it's more or less the same. We need to instill proper parliamentary culture to support institutions. That will be a necessary prerequisite. But in terms of the details, much of it has already been mentioned by Her Excellency, PANDOR. We have good committee systems, we have to work on it. We have transparency in the committee systems. We have transparency by broadcasting entire proceedings of Parliament, and so on and so forth. You know, in fact, you see, Parliament, looking at Parliament, the legislative body, is much easier because we already have guidelines. When I was Speaker, I was working and having a checklist to look at what has been done, what has not been done, through the work of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Union. So it's easy. So this is what I was stating earlier, or hinting earlier. You have measurables. Right? Have you done this? Do you have committees? Are the committees effective in this way or that way? And we have to work on it. And looking at the judiciary too, there are measurables. You must have a good conduct to bind the judiciary. And everything must work on the basis of separation of powers, not in the sense of being antagonistic, but in the sense of sharing of powers, and each checking and supervising, in a way, the other. And the executive, likewise, must respond in a responsible way. As the executive, it must also respect Parliament. It must also respect the judiciary. And quite often we find in some countries, it is all lip service. The executive doesn't respect the legislature, doesn't respect the judiciary, and it goes on and on and on. You have a weak system. So when I speak of institutions, it is time, I think, for us to work on the basis of having guidelines, measurables, all of which can be done if we can sit together and formulate. And I think it would be a good thing in conferences like this that we take it a step further. You can get your ulamas and your professionals to sit down and work on the basis of having some guidelines to govern the institutions at hand so that we know what we want to aim for. And as far as anti-corruption agency is concerned, just to share with you, we've been discussing just earlier before we entered. One of the ideas is to make the anti-corruption agency answerable to Parliament. Not only the anti-corruption agency answerable to Parliament, but even the AG should be answerable to Parliament, and all the important public bodies should be answerable to Parliament. But, mind you, Parliament must also be answerable to the population at large. You don't have that, you do not have another key element. This is a complex matter. And how do you make Parliament answerable? Through you and I, through the citizenry, So when we talk of institutions, we're not only talking in terms of formal institutions, we're also talking in terms of informal institutions. The civil society organizations, religious organizations, everything must key in, and we work on the measurables, each checking on the other, and so that we have a good system of governance.
Okay, thank you. Tan Sri, also with that opportunity, because we are running out of time. I'm so sorry we don't allow any more questions, because I was given a very strict rules to finish by 10:50, but I don't think so we can finish by 10:30 sharp. But Tan Sri, if you have, to answer that questions.
Yeah, 2 minutes, I would say. Jakarta Statement, May 2012, due to the Article 36 of United Nations Convention Against Corruption, has defined the meaning of strong anti-corruption entity, and the most important element in this, the 16th principle has been designed or approved by the members of expert and academician. Together we designed. I was involved in the definition of a strong, where we put 16 elements. One of most important is the independence of the anti-corruption agencies. There are 3 elements of independence: is financial independent, staffing independent, and also operation independent. There are anti-corruption agencies in the world that before they wanted to investigate the members of parliament or ministers or prime minister, they have to get approval from the cabinet. This is not a good, strong anti-corruption agency. And some of it, the law is insufficient. The legal framework only towards the receiver, not only towards the big giver. So the framework, the legal framework has a great impact on the strong anti-corruption agency. Sufficient manpower. You will give them a good machine gun and all that, but nobody can use it though. It's very difficult if you don't have a sufficient machine gun, power or legal framework, but do not have capacity. I advising one country on declaration of asset. They have about 136 officers to manage corruption the whole country, but they have about few thousand declaration of asset. We need about 100 people to look into declaration of asset, but at the same time, you have to do investigation, you have to do prevention, and he has to do education and so on. So if you stop or limited the manpower, you are not going to be strong. It takes me about 3 hours to explain on this Jakarta principle, 16 principle. So I stop there. I will say that a strong anti-corruption agencies as per described in the Jakarta Statement. There are 16 principles and also Article 36. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Just to give 30 seconds a chance for Her Excellency, perhaps.
Well, I think I should have said that in South Africa, the huge disappointment was that from among the freedom fighters, after 10 years of freedom, we had to arrest some of them due to corruption. So it showed that even from among the best, you can get terrible conduct. Hence the importance of even the people, the voters, looking very carefully at who we select to represent us and being very mindful of their conduct both in Parliament and outside the institution in the community. Because parliamentarians are selected by us, the voters. And so we must ensure that we choose among the best.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm so sorry to the audience because of the time constraints. I'm answerable to the Secretariat, despite I'm given the chance to moderate the sessions. And I think we would like to thank again Tan Sri Ariff, Tan Sri Abu KASSIM, as well as Her Excellency Dr. PANDOR for a very interesting, very fruitful discussion on this subject of good governance and integrity. With that, I would like to pass back the mic to the MC.
Thank you once again. Big hand, Professor MADYA, Dr. Mohamad Azam, as a very affable moderator. And thank you very much once again. The biggest applause for our incredible, world-acclaimed speakers here, Tan Sri Muhammad Ariff YUSOF, Tan Sri Abu KASSIM Muhammad, and Her Excellency Dr. NALEDI PANDOR. Truly an incredible moment for us to remember the pointers here for good governance and integrity. Terima kasih, gentlemen and ladies. You may return back to your seats. Thank you very much. Okay, since today is the final day, we're going to start rushing everything. As you know, that every second is really important. I just spoken to a good friend of mine here. For you, Her Excellency, I'd like to say for you is Nia Boha. Thank you very much in your language. Big hand once again, Nia Boha. Thank you.